Hello everyone and welcome back to my channel. Today I have another deck review for you and we're talking about the Llewellyn Tarot by Anna-Marie Ferguson. This is actually one of my favorite decks in my collection, and to be honest I thought I had already done a review on it. I checked my channel and I in fact had not, which is kind of surprising because I love this deck so much, but that explains why I'm filming it now, better late than never. This deck has been out for quite a while, so it's not going to be anything new to anyone, but because it's a favorite, I wanted to have a video on my channel highlighting this beautiful deck. So if you're interested in seeing the Llewellyn Tarot and hearing my thoughts on it, keep watching and let's get into it. So this deck is published by Llewellyn, comes in the standard Llewellyn packaging. So you have that side magnetic closure, it's a slightly bigger box. Here's what the back of the box looks like if you would like to pause this and read this. What I think is really cool about this deck is that the concept is based off of Welsh mythology. If you are interested in Welsh mythology at all, or just Celtic mythology at all, you'll probably really like this deck. And what's really cool, I'll show you when you open here, you have some of the artwork from the deck. I thought this was a really cool little detail on the box. So when you open this up, you have your guidebook, which this one is definitely a bigger one. There's a lot of information in here and I will get into this. I'm just going to get into the cards first. So here we have the cards, and then you have the same design on the back of the cards printed right here, just in kind of a sepia tone to match the rest of the coloring inside of the box. So looking at the card backings, they are not reversible, if that is important to you. I always like to mention it. You have this Welsh dragon here in the center on this little, it looks almost like a shield on the card backings. And then let me show you how this deck shuffles. If you have any decks by Llewellyn, you're going to be very familiar with this card stock. It's basically their standard card stock, so nothing new or different to report there. Some people really like this card stock, some do not. It does not bother me. You just don't want to be too rough with your cards. With this card stock, they can kind of get a little damaged if you're a rough shuffler, so just keep that in mind. But I like this card stock, it shuffles well. What's interesting is when I first got this deck, I wasn't really studying or into Welsh mythology or anything like that, and since getting this deck, not because of this deck, but just a general personal pull I have felt towards Celtic mythology and legends and all of these things, this deck has almost become more valuable to me personally because I have more of a connection to it now that I've learned a bit about the stories. A really good resource if you are interested in Celtic mythology is a podcast I listen to called Celtic Myths and Legends. I believe she is on YouTube and I listen to her on Spotify though, but I will link both below. That is an excellent resource if you are interested in learning about some Celtic myths and legends. She does talk about Welsh mythology, but she also talks about Irish mythology, Scottish mythology, because it's obviously all the Celtic nations. So all kinds of stuff on there. So very, very valuable resource in my opinion. I really love listening to that podcast. I set this book here as a reminder to mention this if you are interested in Welsh mythology in particular and want to go a little deeper. The Mabinogion is kind of like the big text of Welsh mythology. So that is another great resource I just thought I'd mention. So let's get into the cards so you can appreciate how beautiful this artwork is. So when it comes to the Welsh mythology connection with this deck, it's not going to be present in the minor arcana or the court cards in terms of specific stories or anything. It's just going to kind of be depicted in the same art style. But with the major arcana, you will see that there is, let me see if I can get a major arcana card here. I already passed some, here we go. So here we have the moon card and it'll show that it's the moon down here, but then on the top it says a lake of maidens. So that is the Welsh mythological connection or inspiration for that card. Slightly different depiction than a traditional RWS, obviously, because this is more based on Welsh mythology. So really, really beautiful depiction. I feel like this deck would still be appropriate for a beginner that doesn't want to get a just standard RWS, although that's what I would recommend as your starting deck. If you want something a little different as your first deck, I feel like this is close enough where you would be able to study and learn with a standard RWS book, because most of the symbolism will still be there. And where it is tweaked, it's tweaked in a way that's easy enough to understand or connect it to the traditional artwork. For example, right here, the Fool card, typically he's not on a horse, but he's stepping off a cliff, and here he's not stepping off a cliff in the same way, or looking like he's about to. Here he's on this horse jumping across this clearing where there's a river flowing, it looks like, but you still have the white dog, you still have the little sack over his shoulder. There's still a lot of that traditional imagery, where if you were to have this deck as your first deck and you were using some sort of a tarot book to learn, you would absolutely be able to, in my opinion. A lot of that symbolism is still there. So I would call this an RWS clone to an extent, but it does have its personal twist, and I think it's done really well. I just love this artwork. It's kind of got this soft watercolor thing, and the lines are not too perfect on anything. It has just this if you're into more earthy decks, you'll probably love this. I don't know. I think this deck has such beautiful color choices, and it's one of those decks that for me, every time I read with it, I'm like, gosh, I love this deck. And it's one of those that for me, the message never, maybe it's not always what I want to see or hear, but it's always correct, let's say, if that makes sense. So lots of really beautiful cards in here. You've certainly seen this deck on my channel before if you've watched several of my videos, probably, because this is a deck I have mentioned on here in at least a few videos. Look at this star card. This is just probably one of my favorite depictions of the star card ever. Like, it's stunning. And there's a lot of artwork like that in here for me personally. I love this Magician card as well. Again, if you like earthy decks, you're gonna love this. There's lots of forests, lots of moss and greenery and standing stones. Again, if you're into the Celtic thing, if you're into any of those types of things, you're absolutely gonna be drawn to this deck. It's why it's so popular, I think. I'm pretty sure it's still in print. If you're wanting to pick it up, I will check, and if it is, I will mention that below if it's still available. But just beautiful. Look at all of the greenery. The way that the moss is like drawn or painted, it's so beautiful. And this deck does have borders, obviously. I probably should have mentioned that sooner, but you've obviously noticed the borders by now. I know a lot of people don't like these borders. They think they're too big. And a lot of people modify this deck by trimming the borders off. I personally am not a deck modification girl. I love this Hermit card as well. Really, really beautiful. I personally am not a deck modification girl. I personally would be terrified to take scissors to one of my decks and try to trim it, not saying that other people shouldn't. I've seen people do really cool modifications to decks, and I'm like, if only I wasn't so terrified to do that. It's also quite time consuming, so, you know, some people really like doing it though. So yeah, but all to say, these borders do not bother me. I know a lot of people think they're too big and they eat up too much of the card. They would like the image to be bigger, which would be cool, but to be honest, I really like these borders personally. I think they kind of make it feel more storybook. And more mystical in a way. Like, I feel like I'm flipping through a book rather than a deck almost. Something about this almost looks like parchment or something. I love this Wheel of Fortune card. It is obviously the cover, the box. She's like in a forest at night. You can see the stars behind her. Just an incredibly beautiful depiction. And obviously, this is one where it is quite different from the traditional Wheel of Fortune imagery. So there are a few cards that for a beginner maybe would be a little tricky, but I still think you could figure this out. I think it would be okay. This almost looks like the same place as in the Eight of Swords. Where's that? Yeah, it's obviously not identical, but looks like they're in the same place. But that's how the Minor Arcana is overall. Really, really beautiful Temperance card as well. The Minor Arcana, each of the suits, you'll notice it kind of looks like they're in the same setting in a lot of the cards, which I think is really cool. But yeah, I just really, really awesome Tower card. I guess I don't need to mention how fantastic I think every single card is as I'm flipping through. A really beautiful deck. I love the use of colors, and look at this Sun card. Just stunning. Got the traditional death card feel, but it doesn't at the same time. It's a little different. I actually just, on that podcast I mentioned, Celtic Myths of Legends, I actually just listened to the episode about Arawan. I hope I'm saying that correctly. But now these dogs with the red ears are just clicking so much more because I listened to that episode. So again, if you're wanting to really connect with this deck, that is a great resource, at least for the Welsh episodes, obviously. So those are all the cards. Let's go ahead and get into the guidebook. What I really like about this guidebook is the amount of information that is in here. If you're someone like when I bought this deck, I knew virtually nothing about Welsh mythology. It was just the artwork that drew me in at that point in time. So I didn't know anything about these stories. So getting a deck like this, you may be like, I don't know anything about these stories or how they're connecting to what I understand these tarot cards to be. Luckily, this guidebook provides a really good amount of information, I think, for a guidebook that comes alongside a tarot deck in regards to the actual mythology. What you get with a card, let's see. You have the Hermit. For example, here you have a picture of the card, and then it has the description, which here actually, this is why I do think this deck, if you're especially using it alongside the guidebook, would be still one that I think would be appropriate for beginners. Each one of the cards talks about the traditional imagery of these cards in the RWS deck. Here it says, the traditional tarot imagery depicts an old man walking toward the left of the card with a staff in hand. He is dressed in long robes and is generally hooded. Sometimes he holds a lantern that lights his way and sheds enough light to see the surrounding wild, uninhabited landscape and the serpent of wisdom at his feet. In earlier decks, he holds an hourglass rather than a lantern, and he is a figure thought to have evolved from Father Time or Saturn. That is a fantastic amount of information for a deck that isn't even a traditional RWS. There's a different influence happening here. Some traditional RWS guidebooks won't even give you that much of a backstory talking about how this card used to have the hourglass instead of the lantern. All of these little interesting tidbits that I think are so valuable if you are a beginner and you have not heard these things before. But maybe you are a tarot enthusiast and you may learn something new just with these basic little descriptions. So that's why I think that's really cool. But then you also have your story. So for the Hermit card, Myrddin was depicted, which is Merlin, and goes into right here, the popular image of Merlin as magician and prophet is largely the creation of Geoffrey of Monmouth by way of his best-selling book, The History of the Kings of Britain. So it goes into this whole explanation about the backstory of Myrddin as Merlin. Again, I apologize if I am totally botching that pronunciation. But goes into the connection, different pronunciation. You hear, this is what we're talking about, Merlin, and then Welsh bard Myrddin, the connection there. And then it goes into all of this information about Merlin or Myrddin. And then you have your upright meaning, your reverse meaning if you read in reversals, That's a lot of information. So I just think it's such a valuable guidebook. This is one that you don't want to just set to the side and never look at, unless you're just some Welsh mythology buff and you don't need it, perhaps. That would make sense. But for anyone else, I think that this is going to be a really, really helpful resource. Obviously, with your minor arcana, you're not going to have all of that information because these aren't based off of any myths or particular figures in the mythologies, but you're still getting a decent little explanation and then a reverse meaning. And then you even have a glossary, which I think is fantastic. There's a lot of people and places and things being mentioned in here that maybe you've never heard of before. So this is super helpful. And then even at the beginning here, we have plenty of interesting things to read, talking about Wales a bit, Land of the Red Dragon. And we have a little section on tarot, the layout of the cards. So there's lots, some spreads as well. Well, I apologize, my lighting is getting kind of funny here because the sun is moving. But there is a fantastic amount of information in this guidebook, and I think the deck alone is stunning and is enough reason to get it. But I have a few decks in my collection where I think the guidebook is exceptional, and this is one of them. So overall, this deck is, like I mentioned, one of my favorites. The overall feeling of this deck is very cozy and warm and comforting. If I were to describe the energy of the deck, it's very mystical. It kind of just transports you to another place in time. And if you've watched any of my deck reviews, I feel like you probably know that that's kind of right up my alley. So yeah, I love this deck. I highly recommend it. I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Thank you guys so much for watching. And if you aren't already subscribed to my channel and you're interested in tarot and spirituality, seasonal stuff, anything in that sort of realm, I would love it if you would subscribe to my channel and join along on the journey. Thank you guys so much for watching, and until next time, take care and be well. Bye.